In the early 2000s, Wong Woo-suk, a professor at Seoul National University, was renowned for his work in stem cell research. He published 2 articles in the journal Science and was celebrated internationally for having cloned embryonic stem cells. Some considered him a national hero in South Korea. Turns out he allegedly fabricated his data and also coercively obtained the eggs for his studies. Many of the women didn't provide their fully informed consent to use their eggs, and 2 of them were researchers on his own team under pressure to cooperate. In 2009, he was convicted of embezzlement, he was fired, and he had his 2 papers retracted. Wong Woo-suk's work certainly stands out as an example of unethical research, but alas, his case was by no means unprecedented. In 1999, Jesse Gelsinger, a man suffering from a genetic metabolic disease, died while undergoing a scientific study into the effects of gene therapy at the University of Pennsylvania. A report alleged that the directors of the study included Gelsinger in their study even though he didn't meet their health requirements, and they failed to report some of the harmful effects of the treatment they were testing that had already been seen in previous stages. Gelsinger, too, can be considered a victim of unethical research. In 1972, news media reported on a 40-year study at Tuskegee University, then Tuskegee Institute, in Alabama. In collaboration with the U.S. Public Health Service, investigators conducted studies on the effects of syphilis in African American men. The researchers didn't tell their subjects that they had syphilis, nor did they give them the penicillin treatments that would have helped them. Many passed on the disease unknowingly to spouses and children. Many died of syphilis. All of them suffered due to this unethical research practice. During World War II, the Nazis engaged in extensive experimentation on prisoners in concentration camps. They exposed people to frigid temperatures to check the effects of hypothermia. They used toxic gases and chemicals on prisoners to test different treatments for chemical burns. They also forcibly sterilized people to identify the most effective techniques to control people's abilities to procreate. And I could go on. We are talking about the Nazis, after all, and to list all of their research wrongs would take up this entire lecture. Research ethics are the codes, norms, and principles of accepted behavior for those who conduct research. As you can see from the examples I've just given, ethical principles did not exactly inform or inhibit the actions of many researchers in the 20th century. Our task in research is to uncover new ideas and information, but at the same time, we are charged with making sure that the benefits of that new information outweigh the costs, and that we do everything possible to ensure no one is harmed in the course of our research. It also means that we engage in honesty about our work, that we are clear about which ideas are ours and which are borrowed, and that we report the truth of the outcomes of our work and not what we want to be true. Journalists, for example, have certain ethics that they follow in the course of their work. For example, when they agree to a source remaining anonymous, they have to protect that anonymity, just as researchers typically have to keep the identity of our subjects anonymous. Like us, they are tasked with limiting harm, which is one reason they are particularly sensitive to the privacy of minors when describing events in their reports. Also, like us, there is an intent to be objective and neutral in how they approach their work, and to seek out truth rather than proving their own ideas correct. They can't make up facts to fit the story they want to tell. They have to find corroborating information from multiple sources to ensure they are telling a complete and accurate story. What I'm saying is that journalists are researchers. They are us. As you can probably imagine, the unethical studies of the early and mid-20th century led to some changes in how research ethics were viewed. Prior to World War II, there were very few federal regulations in the United States or widespread international principles regarding ethical research. The revelations of the Nazi experiments led to the first such set of regulations, the Nuremberg Code. These are 10 principles of human subject research. To summarize, they are: 1. Subjects must give their voluntary consent to participate in research. 2. Research should be for the benefit of society and not achievable through other means. 3. Experiments should be designed based on existing knowledge such that the anticipated results will justify the experiment. 4. Research should avoid unnecessary suffering and harm. 5. Do not do any research where it is known beforehand that death or disabling injury is likely, except perhaps if the experimenter is also the subject. 6. Risk should never exceed the humanitarian importance of the problem being investigated. 7. Preparation and proper facilities should aim at protecting subjects from even the remote chance of harm. 8. Only scientifically qualified persons should conduct experiments, and only with the highest degree of care. 9. Subjects should be able to end the experiment if they feel they cannot continue. And 10. The researcher must be prepared to terminate the experiment if they have reason to believe continuation will cause harm to the subject. These 10 principles, as we'll see, laid the groundwork for the protections to come. But as we saw from the earlier examples, ethical violations didn't stop in 1947. In 1964, the World Medical Association adopted the Declaration of Helsinki to establish principles of medical research. This document has been amended numerous times and includes many of the same principles of ethics. It states that, quote, while the primary purpose of medical research is to generate new knowledge, this goal can never take precedence over the rights and interests of individual research subjects, end quote. In the United States, the Tuskegee syphilis experiments led to the National Research Act of 1974, which established the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. The commission, commissioned the Belmont Report to, quote, identify the basic ethical principles, end quote, for the conduct of human subjects research. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services adopted the report's ideas as the common rule, the ethical principles regulating U.S. research on human subjects. The Belmont Report was issued in 1979 by the Commission. It is named after the Smithsonian Institution's Belmont Conference Center, where the initial discussions took place. It identifies 3 comprehensive principles of ethical research on human subjects. The first principle is respect for persons. This means recognizing that individuals are autonomous agents and that they have the ability to decide for themselves whether to participate in a research project. It also means that those who might not be able to act completely autonomously, children or those with, as the report put it, quote unquote, diminished capacity, require special protection. How much protection is required will depend on the person and the potential harm of the study, but should be determined with regard to this principle of respect. The second principle is beneficence. This word is ultimately derived from the Latin word beneficus. Bene means good or well, and ficus means doing. Beneficence then means doing good. Like the Hippocratic Oath, this principle requires that researchers do no harm. Subjects must be protected from unnecessary risks of harm, including physical, mental, psychological, social, economic, and legal harms. Additionally, beneficence requires that research maximize the general benefits to society and minimize harms to individual subjects. The third principle is justice. This final principle recognizes the long history of research that used the poor and disadvantaged for subjects, exposing them to harm while doing work that would ultimately benefit the wealthy or advantaged. Justice then calls for fairness in terms of access to research and its benefits and an equitable distribution of the potential risks to individuals. Drawing on these 3 principles, the Belmont Report generated a set of applications that would become required of researchers. First, researchers must solicit informed consent of their potential subjects. This means a few things. Subjects must be given enough information about the project's purposes, procedures, risks, and benefits to make an informed decision about whether they want to participate. This information must be distributed in such a way that the potential subjects can genuinely understand what their participation entails. So their consent to participate must be grounded in a complete understanding of what they will be asked to do, why the research is going ahead, why they are a potential subject, and the risks and benefits of participation to them and the larger society. Those unable to provide consent may be able to do so if a third party is able to act in that person's best interest and potentially provide informed consent on their behalf. Now, sometimes you might not want your subjects to know everything about your study before you start. In one 2010 study of racial bias, researchers found that the skin color of a person offering an iPod for sale online mattered in terms of how many people expressed interest in buying it. Suppose that as a researcher, you told your respondents up front that this is what you were studying. You could imagine that this might have some influence on how they respond in your experiment. Deception, then, is sometimes necessary for our research to work. The Belmont report says that when deception is needed for the research to be valid, the subjects still need to know of any potential risks, if the deception poses additional risks that can't be withheld from them. Withholding information about the risks means they cannot make an informed decision to consent to participate. You also must debrief the participants at some point and tell them about the deception. Essentially, informed consent is about making sure that subject participation is genuinely voluntary. Participants must be able to choose to be involved, and they also must be free to withdraw that participation at any time without facing consequences for doing so. You can't coerce someone into participating, as Wang was accused of in his acquisition of eggs for his stem cell research. You also can't offer excessive compensation such that someone would feel like they can't really turn it down. And as always, special consideration must be given to vulnerable populations. Another application has to do with the assessment of risks and benefits. The proposed research must be justifiable as maximizing societal benefits and minimizing risks. That is, there must be value to society for the research. You can't experiment on people purely to satisfy your own curiosity or to gain personal benefit. All kinds of harm need to be considered, not just physical harm, but psychological, mental, legal, economic, social, and reputational harms. So this entails protecting the identities of your subjects and even keeping the fact that they participated in your study confidential. You may need to have procedures for securing your data, particularly if it contains identifying information. For example, when I do interviews in my own research, I don't use names in the recordings, and any names that my subject use are changed in the transcriptions. The original recordings are in password-protected digital files and are typically destroyed following transcription. The only documents that have names are the informed consent forms that my subjects fill out, and those are kept under lock and key. I do this even though it's unlikely that exposure of their participation or identity would cause any harm, but there's no reason for even the slightest risk. Now, obviously, if your research does pose a risk or is on vulnerable populations, then you have to be extra cautious. Imagine you want to do research on LGBTQ+ rights in a country where it's illegal to engage in same-sex relationships. Those subjects would face serious legal and physical risks if you fail to conceal their participation or identities. The final application concerns the selection of subjects. Quite simply, there must be fair procedures and equitable outcomes in how subjects are selected for research. You can't offer the benefits of your research to particular people or groups and deny them to others on the basis of personal preference. That repeats the mistakes of the past when the groups suffering the risks of research receive none of the benefits. Consider again the African American men in the Tuskegee study on syphilis. They suffered great risks, but saw limited direct benefits from the research. Justice requires that if certain populations are overly burdened and the research you wish to do could pose additional harm in those areas, then less burdened populations should be called upon first as subjects for the research. And as always, vulnerable populations deserve special attention and should only be included in the research if their participation is absolutely necessary for the study's success. The Belmont Report is an important milestone in the establishment of ethical principles for research in the United States, and its principles should inform our practice as we move forward with designing our own studies. But keep in mind that the Belmont Report and the government's common rule apply to the United States only. Research outside the US may have different rules, so if your research is international, you need to consider the rules in your host country, as well as the potential benefits and harms that might be unique to that local population. There is actually a long history of exploiting international differences in ethical procedures for research. For example, in the 1990s, some researchers sponsored by the National Institutes of Health wanted to do a study on a whooping cough vaccine. They wanted to include a placebo group in the study. That means some children in the study would not receive any actual medical treatment, even though they'd be at a higher risk of contracting the disease due to participating in the study. US rules would not have allowed this study. So it was done instead in Italy and Sweden, where the regulations regarding placebos were less strict. In both countries, the study passed ethical review boards. Later, in 2000, the Declaration of Helsinki recommended stricter regulations on the use of placebos, but other international guidelines remain more permissive. Many US-based pharmaceutical companies have moved their clinical studies overseas because it's cheaper and easier to find participants. And while they're still supposed to comply with US laws, that doesn't always happen. It's not always clear if every regulation applies if it differs with the law in another country. And in some cases, the rules may represent a culture clash. The rule about informed consent, for example, requires that an individual make the decision about participating in a study. This Western focus on individualism may cause issues in areas where decisions are more family or community-based. And if participants are flocking to studies because this is their only way to access medical care for an illness or condition, then their participation should not, strictly speaking, be considered truly voluntary. Finally, keep in mind that just because some practices are permitted by law, that doesn't mean they are ethical. Businesses frequently do product testing overseas where there are fewer legal restrictions on such practices. But that doesn't mean the behavior is ethical. Legal and ethical are not the same thing. Here's the key point. Follow the principles of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice, regardless of where you conduct your research. But realize that those principles may entail additional protections depending on where you are. So far, we've been talking mostly about ethics of how to protect your subjects in research, but there are other ethical practices we have to consider. How to behave ethically as a researcher, regardless of the type of research that you do. Even if you never talk to another human being in the course of your research, maybe you study medieval history, for example, and live in the archives with books and manuscripts, you still have to consider your own behavior and ethics. The principles I'm about to discuss will seem pretty basic and self-explanatory, but it's still worthwhile to review them. First, don't make up data. Falsifying or distorting data to make your results look better or support a story you want to tell is an incredible ethical violation. Don't put your personal gain above those you study. Remember, our task is to advance the state of knowledge in the world. There can be some personal benefits to doing that, but those should be secondary. One way to avoid this is to craft your studies so that no matter what the data show, you have something interesting to say. This will limit the temptation to fabricate results. Second, if you have any conflicts of interest or reasons for bias, disclose them. We've already learned about the importance of aspiring for neutrality and objectivity in our research, but let's be fair. It can be difficult, if not completely impossible, to be completely neutral and objective in research. You have to be open to being wrong and discovering things that are not what you hoped, but you also have to be honest about any commitments in your life that might prevent you from being fully objective. If you're being paid by someone to do your research and they have a stake in the outcome, disclose that. Always acknowledge any sources of funding for your work so that your audience can make their own determination about whether that might cause bias in the work. Finally, be sure to properly attribute and protect the intellectual property of others. If you use any words, or maybe even more importantly, ideas of another researcher, you have to give that person proper credit. Cite thoroughly and often. You never want your reader to have to guess which ideas are yours and which you borrowed. My advice is take clear notes as you read through anyone's work. As you read, use symbols or highlighters or some other kind of system to note key claims or ideas of the author. Then use another symbol. I like to put the giant letters M and E, me, to indicate what ideas you have while reading that person's work. Then you know from your own notes which ideas are yours and which ones aren't. Regardless of the system you use, be clear in your own head about your contributions and make sure you properly give credit to others. That also means that if someone substantially helps you in your own work, you should consider whether they would properly be considered a co-author on the study. We discussed a number of basic principles to follow regarding ethical behavior in research. It's always important to keep them in mind, but depending on the kind of research you plan to do, there may be others whose job is to make sure you follow them. Most significantly, research in the United States on humans that is conducted by the government or any entity that receives government funding, directly or indirectly, must be approved by an independent ethical review board. These are usually called institutional review boards or IRBs. Their job is to make sure that the research you want to do follows the principles of the Belmont Report. In 1981, U.S. federal agencies started requiring IRBs to engage in oversight of research. IRBs can be based in universities or other institutes of research, or they can be independent or focused on commercial research. All must be registered with the federal government. Federal regulations require that these bodies have at least 5 members with attention paid to diversity in the demographics and expertise of those members, and that at least one person is not affiliated with the institution housing the IRB. IRBs are not restricted to the US, however. They're found all over the world, although the specific regulations may differ by country. So here's the key. If you want to do any research on human subjects and your work is in any way funded by the US government, you must have IRB approval before you start your research. That means if you're a student at a university, you need IRB approval. If your organization receives grants from the US, you also need IRB approval. If your company wants to get approval from an accrediting agency or US government agency, you need IRB approval. Now, not every researcher necessarily needs IRB approval. If you're doing a personal project for a local organization and want to conduct a survey of your membership, you probably don't have to get IRB approval first. But that doesn't mean you're free to violate the principles of the Belmont Report. Always take care to protect the rights of your subjects, even if you don't have to get permission first. Some categories of research are actually exempt from IRB approval. These include some educational research, research involving publicly or anonymously available records, and research evaluating public programs, as well as a few other areas that are deemed to be very low risk. However, you don't get to decide that your research is exempt. Unless you're doing research that obviously needs no approval, such as the personal project for a local group I mentioned earlier, you still have to submit an application to the IRB. They are the ones who will determine that your research is exempt. Now, one of my many jealousies of my historian friends and colleagues is that since they mostly study dead people, they never have to seek IRB approval. Those of us in the social sciences, medical and health sciences, and other areas of research that study humans and their behavior get to know and love your IRB. Actually, doing an IRB application is a great exercise, even if you don't strictly need to get permission for them for your research. A typical IRB wants to know the point of your project. So that means they want your research question, a brief literature review, and a detailed write-up of your methodology. As with a grant proposal, this forces you to be very methodical about how you plan to approach your research. If you're doing a survey, they want to see your questions. Conducting interviews, they want to know the topics and any specific questions. Planning to run an experiment? They want the full details of your controls, pre-tests and post-tests and treatments. It's like going through a mini peer review prior to starting your research. Remember that I said you have to do this before you start, right? You aren't allowed to begin data collection until you have IRB approval. No setting up interviews, no distributing surveys, no recruiting participants for your experiment. You aren't allowed to have any contact with your subjects until you've convinced the IRB that you're aware of the potential risks your subject may face and that you're prepared and able to protect your subjects from harm. That means you'll also have to answer questions about what possible harm your subjects might face by participating in your study, including psychological, emotional, and reputational harm. They will want to know how you will protect the confidentiality and anonymity of your subjects. They want you to justify the use of any deception too. And if you're working with vulnerable populations, they want you to address their protection. They also want to know how you will store your data and keep it secure. Once you file your application, it'll be reviewed by the IRB and designated to one of three categories: exempt, expedited review, or full board review. Exempt research is that which by its nature imposes no foreseeable risk to subjects. We just discussed some of those categories. Exempt research can typically get approved in a very short period of time, as usually just one person has to review the application. Expedited research poses minimal risk to subjects, meaning that the harm they face is no greater than that which they might experience in their normal daily life. Medical research involving routine and non-invasive procedures, or behavioral research that doesn't involve stress or risk of personal or legal harm if their participation was exposed, are examples of expedited research. Typically, a small number of IRB members, 2 or 3, would review this kind of application. A full review covers everything else and typically requires the approval of the entire ethical review board. Anything that involves intentional deception, invasive procedures, or focuses on sensitive or stressful topics, or where there's any potential for more than minimal harm to the subjects, will require full board review. Regardless of the level of the review, the IRB will evaluate the research proposal to make sure that risk to subjects have been minimized, that the researchers are ready and able to care for their subjects and their data to ensure minimized harm, and that any potential harm is outweighed by the potential benefits of the research. Now, the IRB isn't doing any of this to cause you headaches or delays. They do it because they are charged with protecting human subjects from researchers. They're helping us strike the balance between advancing knowledge and protecting those persons whose participation is necessary for us to do so. Remember, past history has shown that researchers without regulations can be very dangerous. Ethical review boards are there to protect people from our curiosity. It's great that we have questions, but others shouldn't have to suffer in any way for us to find our answers. If you violate the basic ethical principles we've discussed here, consequences can vary. If you've published your work, it may be retracted. You or your institution might lose any federal funding. If you violate ethical principles after an IRB has approved your research, the IRB may lose its standing and ability to grant approval to other projects. You could be reprimanded, suspended, or fired. Certainly your reputation will take a hit. Some states have stricter laws than the federal government. In California, failure to obtain informed consent can, depending on the circumstances, result in a fine and time in jail. Hopefully you'll follow the ethical principles we've discussed here for their own sake. But for the instrumentalists among you, be sure to keep the ramifications that I've just described in mind. Both you and your subjects will be glad you did.